The beauty that I find in this world lies in the utter cruelty inherent in nature itself, the very force that drives all forms of life to adapt to the constant changes that occur from moment to moment. Every hardship, every struggle serves as a crossroads for the species of this planet, a fundamental game of chance that, unfortunately, not many are able to take or even win for that matter. And yet, though the probability of survival remains unbelievably small, though the chance of producing viable, healthy offspring seems practically impossible, there still exists life, even in places which would seem impossible to be inhabitable at all. The sheer frailty of existence is matched only by the inherent will found in all living things, which motivates us to improve ourselves, mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, subconsciously, even under the threat of extinction. As it has been since the dawn of creation, so it shall always be for every living organism, for life can and always will find a way to be. Echoes, Voices of the Silent, Book 2, Takoda Mountains. The year is 1746. With the coast firmly held by the colonists, settlers, homesteaders, and pioneers began pushing west, hoping to stake a claim on the uncharted and certainly bountiful lands. Of these regions that witnessed the greatest push westward were the Takoda Mountains, some 1,690 miles of rolling hills, cloud-covered peaks, and dense forests. Such an environment, having gone untouched by human hands for over 10,000 years, is certain to hold vast, untold wealth. But it is not monetary gain I seek. It is what others would overlook, what others may consider to be bothersome or even outright dangerous. What I seek is knowledge. Knowledge of the limitless array of life forms which call these majestic mountains home. Having left my home and mentor behind in the relative safety of Keys Landing, I set out on my own in order to see for myself this world of creatures that can defy even the laws of natural order. In my time under the tutelage of my mentor, I have seen things most would regard as pure fantasy, a fever dream, or even outright lies. However, because I was witness to these events, I know them to be true, and as a preservist, it is my sworn duty to uncover the mysteries of these creatures that live amongst us, these phantoms that lurk on the edge of our vision, these echoes. What, you may ask, are these creatures, these echoes? To put such things in the simplest of terms, echoes are the last mysteries that still roam this world. They are the dreams which vanish from our memories the moment our eyes open from a deep sleep. They are the thought which disappears before we can wholly grasp it. They are everything we have yet to know about the wide world, the last door left unopened. And here, in these Takoda Mountains, I hope to gain some understanding as to the mechanisms and nature of these creatures that we, as humans, a fellow species of this world, may come to know that we are but one tiny piece in the puzzle of life. Chapter 1. Io Atsila, the Devil's Carnation. July 2nd, 1759. On the edge of the small town of Penshaw there stood the Matthews house. It lay quiet and dark in the late afternoon sun. The shadows of evening were cast long by the mountains that surrounded the town. Only two lights shone within the house. One came from a small lamp, powered by a portable electric battery, which had been set on the bedside table of the upstairs bedroom, and the other came from the logs burning in the kitchen's fireplace, over which a copper pot of stew had been set to simmer. Just outside, Elise, the Matthews' daughter, filled a pitcher with water from the well. Upon seeing it full, she returned inside and carried it to the upstairs bedroom, where, before opening the door, she forced her lips to curl into a smile. She gave a light knock before letting herself in. There upon the bed lay a man and a woman, and though they were still quite young, their condition told a different story. Their faces were both thin and lined with deep wrinkles, Their skin was dry, rough to the touch, and had all but turned an ashen gray, as if every drop of moisture and blood had been drained from them. Their eyes were sunken in, and gave a look of unbearable exhaustion, while their hair, what little there was left of it, had turned to snowy white. Their breathing was irregular and shallow, sounding much more like a dry wind passing over autumn leaves, and each passing breath only seemed to grow fainter and further from the last. As Elise stepped in, the man and woman turned their eyes to meet her. "Mom? Dad? Are you feeling any better? Maybe if you eat something you'll feel better. How about I bring you some of the stew I've cooked downstairs? Does that sound all right?" she asked, trying desperately to maintain her composure. But they did not reply, or rather, they could not. Instead, all they could do was turn up their dry, cracked lips to resemble smiles, as small tears ran down from their eyes. "Mom? Dad?" she asked, drawing closer with her smile now having changed to a worrying quiver. Their breathing grew even fainter as the glimmer in their eyes faded. She rushed to their side and pressed a glass of water to her father's lips. "Here, please drink this, please," Elise pleaded, but when he did not move, she turned to her mother, but she too did not stir. She tried to let the water trickle down onto their dry tongues, but it simply poured out and down their cheeks, and yet she did not give up. She continued to press them until their breathing ceased entirely. In utter shock, Elise gripped their hands and screamed at them to wake, hoping for a response, but they did not grasp back. "Mom! Dad!" she cried, tears streaming down her cheeks as she buried her face into the bed covers, letting the glass fall to the floor beside her. And there she remained until the sun had set beyond the hills and the sky had turned dark. Beneath her breath, she whispered, "I'm sorry." As evening fell, dozens of lanterns were lit across the town as the townspeople silently gathered in the square. With lanterns held aloft, they each nodded to one another and made their way towards the edge of town. Taking notice of the glowing light outside, Elise moved to the window to see what was going on. The townspeople had gathered outside both her house as well as her neighbors that lay just a little ways away. From the crowd that stood before her, a young man approached and held his lantern high. "Please forgive us," he yelled loudly. From somewhere behind him, another voice called out, "Wait! Please wait!" Mayor Reed raced as fast as he could through the pressed crowd. "Please wait, Glenn! There must be some other way. We can help them!" "It's too late for them now. They're already dead. And if we don't stop this right here and now, then any one of us could be next. And I'm not about to let that happen. Our livestock are already falling ill. With this, we can save the town. Now, everyone!" And with that, he hurled his lantern at the house, the glass shattering and the oil coating the wooden walls. The wick ignited the air, and soon a portion of the house was aflame. "No! Stop!" Reed cried out, pressed against the others, pleading with them to lower their lanterns. But still more and more of the crowd cast their lanterns against the house, some managing to break through the windows to engulf everything inside in a tempest of fire. Elise's screams echoed from the house as a lantern had crashed through the window of her parents' bedroom, landing over her parents' silent bodies. But not a single person outside could hear her over the roar of the fire and the shouts of encouragement coming from the crowd. Without thinking, she immediately worked to remove the covers and protect them, trying hard to pull them away from the window. But as the fire spread, the bed was soon swallowed up in flames. Elise raced from the room, tears in her eyes, but everywhere she went, she was met by intense heat, smoke, and fire. "Burn it! Make sure it all burns! Leave nothing!" Glenn yelled out. Elise's eyes and lungs burned from the smoke. Left blinded, she had to feel for her way. "I have to get out," she coughed, trying desperately to see. Having left the crowd, Reed made his way to the back of the house. He opened the door and was met by a wave of heat that burned his eyes, but still he pressed forward. He found Elise upon the floor. Taking her up upon his shoulder, he carried her out as the weakened supports for the second floor gave way. Reed gave a wide berth to the crowd as he brought Elise back to the town, but just before she fainted, a voice carried over to them from the crowd. "Make sure it doesn't spread!" 3 weeks later. "We'll set up the wall to block off the homes on the other side of the stream, all the way down to the Phillips house at the end of the valley. I'll get started here. Get the logs down to be trimmed," Glenn said as he picked up his axe, while the others began dragging away the trees that had just been felled from the hillside towards the valley below. The hills surrounding Penshaw had once been covered by a thick forest, but now so much so was gone that the area was hardly recognizable. The hills were bare save for hundreds of stumps, shabby undergrowth, piles of festering leaves, and a few scattered scrubs of hardy grass. Glenn headed up towards the nearest tree and prepared to drive his axe home, but just at that moment, a voice hailed him from somewhere further up the hill, from within the forest. From the shadows of the trees emerged a young man, wearing a heavy jacket over a white button-up shirt and dark brown slacks over pointed-toe boots. Over one shoulder was slung a cloth bag, while in his hand he held a case about the size of a bushel of apples that was kept closed by a brass latch. Connected to the side of the case was a small, portable elecator, but what stood out the most about this man was the pair of orange-tinted reflective riding goggles he wore. The man waved at Glenn. "Hello? Excuse me, but is that Penshaw down there?" "It is. What of it?" Glenn replied. The man reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded notice. "Well, I noticed this flyer in Mason City and thought that I could assist with the apparent problem here." "Another one? That makes 4 already. The old man just can't let it go. Listen, pal, you'd be better off turning around and heading right back to where you came from. No doctor can help us with this." "Doctor? No, sir. I'm no doctor. I'm a preservist. My name is Jacob Norwood, and based on what Mr. Reed wrote, your problem seems to stem from the actions of an echo." "I have no idea what you're going on about, and frankly, I don't care. Whatever this is isn't one of your echoes, as you call it. As you can see, we have everything under control, so Penshaw doesn't need your services. Thank you." "I'm afraid I can't just up and leave. It's against my policy to abandon any job that I have become involved with, and from what I've seen here, this town is in desperate need of help. Now, if you can't show me to Mr. Reed, I'd be more than glad to go myself," Jacob finished as he began marching down the hill. Glenn took a hold of Jacob's shoulder and pulled him back. "I said you're not going! If you knew what was going on, then you'll understand why you need to just turn around and leave." "Well, I don't understand, so would you be so kind as to fill me in?" Jacob could sense the tension and anger welling up in Glenn. It was obvious that he's had to say what he was going to say plenty of times before, and having to tell it one more time seems as though it had pushed him over the edge. "People have been dying left and right. The cemetery's gotten so full that we've had to leave folks lie where they drop. Some kind of sickness is going around, and if we don't finish this whole region might end up like Penshaw. I've never heard of an illness just coming out of nowhere and causing people to drop dead. We've even burned houses, hoping whatever caused the sickness would die in the flames." Glenn laughed. "Lot of good that did us." "You burned them? You don't even know what's going on and you burned houses down?" "Hey, we have no idea what's making people sick. For all we know, everything that they touch could be contaminated. My family's gotten sick and died after trying to help our neighbors. I told them not to go and they didn't listen to me." Glenn buried his face into his hands. "And that's why we're going to burn the entire town down." "Now, hold on a minute. What you're planning could do more harm than good at this point. What choice do we have? Let the town burn or let all the Dakotas get sick and die? If you ask me, the town's a small price to pay to save the lives of everyone, including you, sir." Jacob could see that this argument was going nowhere fast, If there was going to be any hope of help, Jacob had to come up with a solution. Okay, look, I can understand where you're coming from. Believe me, I do. But if there are still people down there, then it's my job to try and save them. There are still people down there, right? I doubt you'll find anyone except the old man at this point. Regardless, I need to check and be sure. Look, we're both desperate here to see this whole matter dealt with in the most level-headed fashion possible. But I don't want or need to have an entire town in flames on my conscience, and I doubt that you do either. Glenn's anger seemed to lower, but not completely subside. He quietly contemplated Jacob's words. At least give me 3 days. You can hold off on this plan of yours for that long, can't you? If there's nothing to be done, I'll be out of here before you know it. But if there's even one person left down there that needs my help, then I'll do everything I can to see them through. Glenn looked long and hard at Jacob. This man had come out of nowhere and now planned to risk his life in order to save people he had no idea if they were alive or not. Whatever he planned to do, it was either being very serious about it or very stupid. Whatever the reason, Glenn knew he was right. Fine. You've got till noon, 3 days from now. I'll talk to the others, but I'm sure they'll hold off. But if something hasn't been done, if we find out that you failed and everyone's dead, then you better be as far away from the town as you can get. Otherwise, it won't be my problem if you get caught up in it. The two then shook hands, their firm grasp telling them how serious the other was. I don't think I got your name, Jacob inquired. Glenn Reed. I'm sure you won't forget it any time soon. I'm sure I won't. And with that, Jacob then headed down the hill towards the town with the intent of doing everything in his power to make sure Glenn's plan would not succeed. At the foot of the hill, a number of men and women were setting up the cut timbers to form a wall. The men dug the pits to hold the posts, while the women raised them up. They all eyed Jacob with a look of heartache and exhaustion as he passed by. Now Penshaw was not a very big town, having only a few hundred people at most, and the houses were set up to line a large cul-de-sac that made up the main square of the town, with a few smaller streets that encircled the square. A few houses lay scattered apart from the main group, and beyond that the town was surrounded by large tracts of grazing fields and crops. Most of the outlying houses were little more than piles of blackened char. Some were still letting off smoke. From one corner of the town there was an especially large pillar of smoke, but from where he stood, Jacob had no way of telling what might have been the cause of it. Without animals, the fields surrounding the town looked so desolate. The grass was dried out and overgrown, and spilled over onto the path. The town, what little there was left of it, had been spared from Glenn's efforts, having burned it down, looked more like a ghost town. Most of the windows and doors had been boarded up, and it was almost completely silent, save for the numerous crows still perched upon the rooftops, occasionally flying down to pick at a corpse that had been left to rot by the wayside. Moving further, a foul stench filled the air. It smelled so strongly that it was as if everything surrounding Jacob had been saturated by it. It was upon looking down a side street that he found both the source of the smell and the smoke that he had seen from the hill. At the end of the street there stood what appeared to be an old storage shed for wagons and carriages, but all that remained now was a few pieces of the old frame, charred black and crumbling with every gust of wind that blew across them. How long ago it had been set ablaze Jacob could not guess, but amidst the ruins were dozens of ash-covered skeletons overlaid with corpses that looked as though they had been tossed on while the fire was still going, though it had become far too weak to catch on as added fuel, but still warm enough to roast the flesh. Jacob covered his nose, though the smell still left a bitter taste in his mouth, like rotted fish that had been left out in the sun for a week. Further in, towards the town square, Jacob got his first real look at just how bad things had gotten. Here and there, scattered about the town square, were a number of people, most looking far too weak to even stand. Some sat huddled together against the walls, their thin, gray-skinned bodies almost engulfed by their clothes, and their hair had either completely fallen out or turned a snowy white. As Jacob passed by, some would lift their heads, revealing their sunken, tired eyes to him, while others would reach out to him feebly. Not a one offered a greeting to him. Instead, only a dull, rasping gasp or dry cough escaped their lips as he passed by. As a withered woman stretched out her feeble hand to him, Jacob gently took it, his fingers easily encompassing her wrist. Beneath his fingers he could faintly feel her pulse as it grew slower and weaker with each beat. He then set his case down, opened it, and retrieved a jar containing tiny brown pills. Shaking some out onto his hand, he then passed them to each one of the sick, who looked up at him with tear-filled eyes. "These will help you feel better. Please take them," to which they did as quickly as their thin, weak arms would let them pass the pills up to their lips. As he continued on, he kept this thought silent. "At the very least, I can make your passing more bearable." At the far end of the square there was a house with its door wide open and lights shining from the open frame and windows. A number of the sick sat on a bench near the door, although their condition seemed to be far better than everyone else's. The color was not completely gone from their faces, and their hair, while thin, was not yet wholly gray. Jacob came up to them with curiosity. "How are you feeling?" he asked the nearest man. "I'm much better, thanks to Ashton and Elise. Without them, I'm sure I'd either be in a ditch or like those poor folks I saw you helping out," he replied with a weak smile. "Is Ashton inside? I would like to speak to him." "Of course, but he may be a little busy. I'm sure he could use a little help. Are there others inside that are sick?" "Oh, about a score or so. Bless that man for his efforts. I'll see what I can do." Straight inside was a short hallway with stairs leading up to the second floor. To the left was a parlor with about 10 or so tables turned into makeshift beds, as was the living room to the right. From somewhere towards the back of the house there came the voices of two people. One was that of an older-sounding man, and the other was that of a young woman or girl. Jacob gave a knock to the frame, but the two voices seemed too preoccupied to give any notice to him. With a cautious step, Jacob came inside and gave the parlor a once-over before settling in on a young boy who looked partway between being as pale as the people he gave the medicine to and those out in front of the house. His breath was coarse and shallow, and his arms were lacking tone. Jacob sat down his case and opened it up to pull out a photon bar wrapped in a black cloth with one end left exposed. Giving it a small tap against the side of the table, the exposed end began to glow a bright yellowish green. Jacob gave a quick glance into the boy's eyes, nose, and mouth. Whatever this Ashton had done for these people, it was working, but from what he was bringing them back from, or how he was doing it, Jacob did not know. As Ashton walked into the parlor, Jacob stood up from the boy's side with a look of being impressed and relieved. "It's amazing what you've done here, Mr. Ashton." Ashton nearly fell back in surprise. He hadn't expected anyone to be up, let alone to see a stranger like this in his home. "My gosh, you've nearly scared me to death. At least knock before you enter." I did, but I didn't get an answer." "Well, you should at least wait until somebody can come." Sorry, you're right. Let me introduce myself. My name's Jacob Norwood from Mason City. I heard from a notice posted that a Mr. Reed was seeking help from any and all doctors." Yes, Ashton Reed's my name. I want to thank you for coming. As you can see, we're in need of an expert here." "Well, I don't know if you could call me an expert, since my field mostly involves echoes, and medicine isn't really my strong suit, but I'll certainly do whatever I can to help." Good. That's just what I wanted to hear. Now, if you'll follow me." Ashton led Jacob into the living room, where 4 people had been laid out. A young girl sat at the side of a great, emaciated woman and tried to feed her some sort of stew. Although the stew was lacking in the spice-enriched smells as those in other towns that Jacob had passed through, the vegetables did wonders to lift the foul smell outside from Jacob's nose. Aside from those outside, as I'm sure you've seen, these 4 are by far in the worst condition, and everything we've done hasn't helped at all. How's Mrs. Stevens doing, Elise? I don't know if she won't eat it or if she can't eat it. She hasn't even opened her mouth. Let me take a look at her, Jacob said as he brought his photon bar to the woman's eyes. Her pupils did not react at all to the light, and her irises looked glazed over. Putting the bar aside, Jacob felt for her pulse. It was weak and slowing down. How long has she been like this? Since early this morning, Ashton replied. She had a coughing fit, and then after she settled down, she became like this. It may be too late, but I'll give something a try. Can you bring me my case? Ashton ran back to the parlor and returned with Jacob's case. Jacob pulled up a short stool, set his case down, and unlocked the latch. Lifting the cover of the case, a number of shelves sprang up and back, each one filled with a number of small jars, metallic tools, pens, and countless other objects. On the front of the case was a number of drawers and one small cabinet. Beneath the rising shelves on top of the case, a spring lock snapped, causing a small brass microscope and flexible lamp to emerge. Jacob opened up each drawer one by one, revealing precision instruments, a mirror, a malachite stone and ink jar, a number of specimen containers, a water purifier, and a mortar and pedestal. It was a veritable chemistry lab. Jacob traced his fingers over the row of small jars, each of which contained something resembling dry leaves, stems, and buds from what looked to be either weeds or flowers, and some even had small, smooth river stones. Jacob pulled out a jar holding a purple flower and stem. On the jar was a label that read, Sula Uno. He plucked one of the small buds growing off the stem, and then pulled out the mortar and pestle, to which he ground the bud down into a fine powder. From a small drawer in his case, he pulled out a match and lit it, letting the flame cause the powder to create fumes. Cover your nose and mouths, please. Ashton and Elise both held their breath as Jacob let the fumes waft into Mrs. Stevens' nose. After a few seconds, Miss Stevens suddenly jolted to life and inhaled deeply before coughing hard. After a few seconds of this, a few small, blackened flakes wafted out from her lips, and she lay back down and seemed to breathe without much difficulty. What was that? Elise said, amazed. It's an echo that forces muscles to relax. It's especially powerful and could cause numbness. Whatever she had must have tightened the muscles in her throat, which is why she couldn't eat. Give her an hour or so for the effects of the echo to wear off, and she should be able to eat normally again. An echo? Elise whispered to herself. Can we discuss this somewhere? Jacob asked as he closed his case. Of course. The kitchen will give us a place to sit. Elise, please continue to look after them while I speak to Mr. Norwood. Yes, sir. The kitchen wasn't exactly clean, but it was better than trying to talk over other people trying to rest. As Jacob sat down, he pulled out a notebook from one of his satchels and a pen. To get to the point, I need you to tell me everything that's happened since the start. Very well, though I must tell you that I don't know all the details. It all started about 6 weeks ago. The Campbell family stopped showing up in town, so a few of us went to investigate. We found both of the Campbells dead. The weather had been particularly hot that season, so we didn't think much about it and chalked it up to heat exhaustion. Several days later, the Heath family complained of feeling sick and stopped showing up in town, and along with them were the Larson family, the Barnes family, and the Andrews family. It was then that we started to fear sickness was spreading, and so we called in a doctor to check things out. All but the Barnes had died before the doctor arrived. He said there was nothing that he could do, packed up his things, and left. And in less than a week, there we were, burying 14 more people. Over the next few days, more and more people got sick and died. No matter what we did to try and help the sick, things only seemed to get worse. Then, one day, the people who tried to help the sick suddenly got sick themselves, and it was at that point that we started thinking the sickness might be contagious. It was then that Glenn and the others burned the houses of the Matthews family and the Fisher family. Elise in there is the only one of her family that survived. Both her parents died from the sickness shortly before their house was destroyed. Elise has an older brother, but he's taken to the Winona frontier, and she hasn't heard from him for a few years now. And so, since we couldn't get in touch with him, I took her in, and she's been helping me ever since. So, things seem to have started with the Campbells. Was there anything in particular about their condition that might have been the spark to the sickness? What did the Campbells do on a day-to-day basis? The Campbells lived close to the forest. On most days, Liam would be working in his wood shop and occasionally head up into the forest for timber. His wife Sarah would gather stuffs from the forest for cooking, such as mushrooms and nuts. With it having been a wet spring, I'm sure there was plenty to find. Maybe what she found could have been poisonous. I doubt it. Sarah had a keen eye for what was good to eat. If she had thought something wasn't safe, she would have left it well enough alone. I still have reason to believe that Miss Campbell found something she wasn't aware of, the dangers. I can't say as to whether she did or didn't. Then the Heath family. What about them? The Heaths lived near the Campbells and were on good terms. Sometimes the two families would have small get-togethers and have dinner. Maybe the Campbells caught a disease and spread it to the Heath family during one of those get-togethers. It's certainly possible. But what about the Larson, Barnes, and Andrews families? What happened to them? It's strange, but those three families lived a bit of a walk away from the Heaths and Campbells. In fact, they lived pretty close to Elise's family's home. And the only time the Heaths were near to any of the other three families was when a meeting or festival was being held in town. But nothing of the sort was going on at the time. It was shortly after the Heath family got sick that the Larsons' oldest daughter got sick. I don't know about the details, but it wasn't long after she got sick that the rest of her family became ill. The same sort of thing happened with the Barnes and the Andrews. First their oldest children would get sick, and then the rest of the family would follow shortly after. Interesting. Now I notice that the fields around here are overgrown. I thought Penshaw had livestock. We did, but whatever first made the Campbells and Heath sick, the animals caught it as well. We didn't really notice them getting sick until around the time after the Larson family got sick. Most of them began acting strange before they died, and those that didn't die outright we had to put down. So it seems to all center on the Campbells. I should probably take a look at their home. I'll have Elise take you there. I can't leave everyone here alone. Very well. Elise and Jacob walked out to the edge of town, to the farthest house from the hill from which Jacob had first arrived. Close to the former tree line there sat a low, small house built of rough-cut timber, and nearby was a woodworking shed. With the house having been left to rot, and the grounds left untended, the pastures which would have been kept behind the surrounding fence now grew right up to the front steps. The inside of the house fared little better. Just about everything was covered with a thick layer of dust, but it all looked as though somebody had simply up and abandoned it. Jacob and Elise gave the house a once-over, with Jacob collecting samples of the dust and a few small black pellets from the kitchen, but nothing in particular seemed to catch his eye. Elise always followed a few steps behind him, wondering at all times what he could be searching for. After all, to her this was just an empty house. After combing the house, the two checked the shed, but like the house, there was nothing. But then, just as the two were coming out the back entrance of the shed, amongst the grass, Jacob seemed to find what he was looking for. Jacob turned over the dry grass that grew all around the entrance of the shed, and there, growing in a small bunch, were tiny red flowers. Unlike the grass that hid them, these flowers looked exceptionally healthy and vibrant. He quickly plucked one from the dirt, but as he did, he saw the roots recoil and the flower closed up. A moment later, a small cloud of yellow dust escaped from the blossom. Jacob made sure not to inhale the mist as he brought it close to inspect. Elise peered over his shoulders. "Did you find something?" "Maybe." Jacob pulled out a small journal that was filled with tiny scribbles and sketches. After flipping through several dozen pages, he settled on one. He then headed over, out deeper into the pasture where he looked beneath a number of patches of overturned grass before nodding and heading back. "Here, take a look at this." Elise watched as the tiny flower curled up in her hands like a dried leaf. "Okay, I must be missing something here. This is just a flower. How can a flower kill people?" "It might not look like much, but believe me, it is more than capable of causing what has happened in Penshaw." The flower then began to move its roots along the creases on Elise's palms, as if it were searching for a place to plant itself. Elise dropped the flower with a gasp, and crushed it beneath her foot. After having catch her breath, she looked back at Jacob. "What exactly is that thing?" "Its name is Atsila, which means death flower, but I call it the devil's carnation. You might know it as an echo," he said as he plucked another one and placed it in a small glass vial. "Echo?" How do I explain this? It's a name I and other preservists like myself use for creatures that look like plants and animals, but that's where the similarities end. How they look keeps most people from even knowing that they exist, but how they act and live is entirely different from what you might expect. Think of it like a reflection. Your reflection looks like you, but it reverses your every move. It's the same with the devil's carnation. It looks like a flower, but instead of being beautiful and harmless, it's quite easily able to kill you. So, how can this devil's carnation thing kill? Well, the thing about this species is that it can grow practically anywhere, with or without sunlight, so long as it can plant its roots. It can even grow in hardened clay when other plants can't. When I saw them growing back there, I was reminded of a similar case up north, a small town named Hallfield. Well, it wasn't even a town at that point. About 10 years ago, a small group of settlers made their way deep into the mountains and found a valley full of the devil's carnation. Thinking it was just a simple meadow, they thought they could plow up the land and settle there. Within 2 weeks, 50 of the settlers died along with their cattle, horses, and dogs. Only one survived, and that was because he had been sent back to sign property papers back in Sutton. In the case of what's going on here, I believe that they've taken root inside everyone who's sick. Do you mean to tell me that there are flowers growing inside of everyone? Exactly. The Campbells must have accidentally eaten something that had been laced with seeds of the carnation. In turn, any food that Miss Campbell threw out also had seedlings and sprouts. The flowers spread into the pastures and were eaten by your livestock, which then spread to everyone who ate them. As the animals died, they helped spread the carnation closer and closer into town. Once it got into Penshaw, it got easier for everyone else to get infected. I can see why Glenn would think that this is some kind of disease. So, how do we deal with this? First, tell me what it is that you've been feeding the people you've been taking care of. I noticed that they didn't look as bad off as some of the others. It was just vegetable stew. It's all that we have left to offer since our livestock died off and settlers haven't been coming anywhere near here since the doctors left. I noticed that there was a lack of spices, so what did you use for seasoning? Salt. It's about all that we can get so far from Mason City since sellers charge more for everything else. I should have noticed it sooner. Miss Matthews, I have to thank you for all that you've accomplished, but we need to hurry as we still have a lot of work to do and not a lot of time. I'll need you to get plenty of salt and hot water. We are going to save Penshaw. The two quickly returned with all speed to Ashton's house. Get Ashton to help you with the salt. I'll collect the water. As Jacob took a bucket and began collecting water from the well at the town center, Elise hurriedly explained all that Jacob had shown and told her to Ashton. Understandably, Ashton was more than a little confused and skeptical, but time was short, and she ordered him to help collect as much salt as they could find. The three then brought everything that Jacob had requested to Ashton's kitchen. Jacob set the water to boil as Elise and Ashton poured in the salt. Jacob pulled out the vial containing the carnation and showed it to Ashton. What's this? It's the cause of all your problems. Just watch. Jacob allowed the salt to dissolve before taking up a cup's worth. He then poured the water into the vial, which immediately caused the carnation to curl up and turn brown. Its leaves and petals fell from it till all that remained was a dried-out stem. This will do. Elise looked at the dead brown husk of the carnation and began to feel a little annoyed, both at herself and having remembered Jacob's use of the Sula Uno from just a short while ago and what it was able to do for Miss Stevens. But why do we need salt and water? Why not just use that thing that you used before? Had I done so, it would have taken more than the entire echo to help you all, and doing so would have killed the Sula Uno. But it's an echo, Elise argued at him. The echo hurt people. Why shouldn't we just kill them? Not all echoes are killers, Elise. Some do harm people, I'll grant you that, but like every living thing, they do what they do in order to survive. Add to that some echo actually help people with illnesses or conditions that medicines can't. It's my job as a preservist to help people live alongside the echoes, not simply kill them because it's the easy way out. Jacob then began to grind down the salt, and from over his shoulder he muttered, "After all, Elise, you, like the echo, are a living, breathing thing, and I want you to continue living as well." Taking the powdered salt, he added it to the now boiling pot and stirred it till it had fully dissolved. After it had cooled down, he then brought a cup full to the nearest of the sick. At first they refused because of the bitterness, but after some coaxing from Ashton, they drank it up. Within minutes they began to cough violently, and as though they were choking. With some help from Jacob, their fits subsided as from their mouth flew a cloud of brown, crumbled leaves, which perfectly resembled those of the carnation from the vial. Elise looked on in amazement, while Ashton was both shocked and perplexed. "Astonishing," Ashton said, picking up a handful of the leaves. "Help the others drink. The sooner, the better." One by one they moved from sick to sick, having them drink the salt water, and each one in turn coughed out leaves. Most stopped coughing after an hour had passed, and had fallen asleep out of exhaustion, but others continued on, with some coughing so hard that their palms were covered with specks of blood, in addition to the dried leaves. "I was afraid of this. How long have these been sick?" "At least 4 days. Then the carnations will have spread deeper than just their stomachs. There's a chance that might have inhaled the seeds, and they could be clogging up their lungs, just like Mrs. Stevens." Jacob opened up his case and brought out a mortar and a syringe. "Mr. Reed, I need you to crush the salt into a powder and put it into some boiling water. Have them inhale the vapors. The mixture should reach their lungs and at least diminish the carnations. After that, I'll give them some medicine to help them cough. Maybe we can get them all removed. Elise, bring me a cup of the salt water. I'll have to inject the solution into their blood to deal with any carnations that might have grown deeper." With a fury, Ashton pounded down the salt till it formed a cloud over his hands. He then followed Jacob's instructions to the letter, holding the sick upright so as to inhale the salty steam rising out of the cauldron of boiling water, setting over the fire in his kitchen. After helping them return to their beds, both he and Elise gave to each of them some of the medicine as directed by Jacob, which prompted them to cough rather violently. Each expulsion left a small cluster of brown leaves and seed pods upon the floor until only spit was left. Jacob then injected a small amount of the solution into their blood. The extent of the carnation's growth into the sick he could not know, but if it had passed beyond what he had hoped, then they might as well be as far gone as the people outside in the street. After having injected the last one, Jacob set the syringe aside. "All we can do now is wait." As the day soon turned to night, the three continued to rotate watching over the sick, continuing to have them drink the salt solution or breathe in the vapors from the kettle over the fire, until their breathing was no longer labored or raspy. Jacob had refused sleep, instead wishing to see the people's treatment until they at least looked like they were on the mend, and as he watched over them, Elise kept an awestruck watch over him. The first day and night passed with little change in the sick. Some color had returned to their skin, but they were still too weak to move on their own. Jacob, Elise, and Ashton continued to rotate in their duties of tending to the sick. When it came time for Ashton to watch, Jacob would move over to a window that had a clear view of the surrounding hills. From there, he could watch as Glenn and the others worked, non-stop. Every so often, Elise, after waking up from sleep following her shift, she would come to Jacob and inquire about the echoes. She asked of the notebooks he carried and the contents of his case, which he displayed to her little by little, from the jar containing the Sula Uno flower to a stone about the size of a fist that Jacob called the Udana Ama, which could make any dirty or poisonous water clean and safe to drink. His notebooks, it seemed, she could not close, for each page contained beautiful drawings and detailed descriptions and lore over the echoes that Jacob had come across in his travels, which he told Elise as she sat there by the light of the fire beneath the boiling pot, hanging on his every word, completely awestruck by the world unfolding before her. By the second night, Elise and Jacob had nearly gone through every scrap of paper that he had brought with him. Elise would remain close to Jacob, continually asking him questions about both himself, the echoes, and in all that time Ashton could not help but notice Elise's growing interest in the man who had so selflessly showed up to help them. By 2 o'clock in the morning, Elise had finally exhausted herself and fell asleep. Feeling tired himself, Jacob took one last look out of the window towards the hills. Only a few more hours, he muttered to himself, just before nodding off to sleep. Elise suddenly woke Jacob with a start, who nearly fell off his seat in shock. "Mr. Norwood, please come quickly!" Jacob, still half asleep, got to his feet and let Elise pull him outside to the square, where Ashton stood before a number of men and women that he recognized from when he first came to Penshaw. Upon seeing Jacob, Ashton came to him. It's terrible, Mr. Norwood. I've tried to explain things to them, but they won't listen to a word I say." Jacob did his best to appear confident, but deep down he was more terrified than he ever thought possible. "I'll try talking some sense to them, but I need you to be prepared for the worst. Get them out of town." He nodded back towards the house. "Yes, sir," Ashton said before promptly disappearing into the house alongside Elise. Jacob then approached the crowd to where Glenn looked as though he was going to collapse. "Just how long are we going to wait? For all we know, the sickness has already spread to West Wind or Bradford by now," cried one. "The dead are littering the street. There's no one left here to save," screamed another. "Please, everyone, calm down. I saw for myself how everything was. Those that we thought to be dead are getting better. Zachary, your little boy was sound asleep. And Miss Thompson, your husband, told me that my father had helped him all last night without so much as an hour of sleep." "Ha! Is that what Ashton told you to tell us? How do we know that you aren't sick as well? For all we know, you could be sick right now. You lost your family 3 weeks ago, and we're the first to want to stop the sickness from getting out. So what is it? Just what is it that's changed your mind? Is it that senile old man? Just because he refuses to leave, so now you'd rather everyone get sick here and die? Now, Daniel, don't you dare question me. You never lost anyone, so don't you dare stand there and second-guess me. I know what I saw, and I saw your families alive and well." Jacob put his hand on Glenn's shoulder. Glenn relaxed somewhat from Jacob's grip, but there was still fear in his eyes. "My good people, I understand your concerns, but your suspicions are misguided. The culprit was not a sickness as you so deeply believe, but rather it was something that you all have so easily overlooked. We listened to 5 doctors tell us that it was an illness that killed our families. What makes you think your explanation will outweigh theirs? Because I have proof. But if you had taken a moment to notice the circumstances and the conditions of your families, then you could have easily figured this out for yourselves. It was not some sickness, but rather it was something called an echo. In this case, it was one called the devil's carnation. It is a type of flower. And we're just supposed to believe that flowers killed them? Just how dim-witted do you think we are? And echoes? If such a thing existed, then how come we've never seen or heard of them before? Because you never thought to look for them, let alone even knew they were there at all," he said as he reached into his pocket. "I've heard enough. I bet that the both of them are sick. Lock them in and let's get this over with." Some from the crowd stepped forward and forced Glenn and Jacob back into Ashton's house using axes. It seemed as though they were too far afraid to touch them directly. Once inside, the door was slammed shut behind them and barred. "I thought you said you could convince them." "I guess I expected too much from them." "Well, come on, we can't just sit here." Upon standing, they found that Ashton's house had been emptied. Elise appeared from the kitchen. "Mr. Norwood, this way." Glenn stared in shock. But I thought you had died. How did you—" Behind them, they could hear the crowd shouting outside as one by one they began to set fire to the houses. First by throwing lantern oil, and then igniting them with their torches. One by one, both the houses and the bodies surrounding the square were enveloped in flames, before a couple from the crowd began to approach Ashton's house. "There's no time. We need to get out of here." The three of them raced out the back door of Ashton's house, with Jacob quickly locking up his case and taking up his bag and journals. As the two exited the house, they came to a small open space wherein was prepared a large cart, into which the healing people had been set. Ashton and Elise were just helping Mrs. Stevens as Jacob and Glenn came outside. Jacob set his case and bag in the cart and immediately moved to the forward bar, pressing with all of his strength in order to urge the cart forward. Elise and Ashton came to his side and started pushing as well. Glenn, still in shock from seeing both the townspeople going insane and Elise being alive, simply stood there. "Glenn, help us!" Ashton cried out. Snapping out of it, Glenn took his place at the back of the wagon and put every ounce of his strength he had into pushing. Little by little, the four of them managed to make their way towards the hills at the east end of town. By sheer luck, they managed to slip past the roving bands of the crazed town people, who set fire to just about everything that caught their eye. It was until they passed the house at the far end of town and the halfway constructed wall that Glenn had ordered them to build did they begin to slow down. As they ascended the hills and reached the tree line, Glenn looked back towards Penshaw to see every house now engulfed in flames. His home, his friends, his family, all of it gone, and yet he found himself unable to shed even a single tear. They slowed the wagon to a stop in order to catch their breath, with each of them taking a moment to look at what had become of their home. "We can't go back, not after that," Ashton said as they rolled the wagon to a stop at the top of the hill. "If we keep going this way, we should get to Bradford in a few hours. After that, I'll see what I can do for everyone," Jacob said as he began pushing once more. While the town of Bradford did indeed lay ahead of them, they would first have to get to the nearest road, which lay nearly 7 miles through thick forest and uneven terrain. A few times they nearly lost control of the wagon when Jacob and Elise slipped in the muck beneath the rotting layers of leaves. Every so often they would have to pull the wagon's wheels free from a pothole or a rock, but no matter how tired they felt, Jacob continued on, as if he were unable to stop for even a moment, and all the while Elise stayed by his side to help. It was nearly dusk by the time that they had managed to escape the forest and find the road. There were few others out at this time, as the roads grew more dangerous at night, but luckily for them, a team of woodsmen returning home lent them the use of a few spare horses, allowing the four of them some much-needed rest. In almost an instant, as they settled into the wagon, they each fell asleep, with Jacob being the last to close his heavy eyes. It was only by the jostling of the woodsmen that they finally awoke and found themselves surrounded by the houses of Bradford. "You all look so peaceful that we thought it might be rude to wake you, but it was getting dark, you see," said a young man. "Think nothing of it, but we owe you so much for helping us out," said Ashton as he stood up. One by one, the woodsmen aided them down. As Jacob stepped down, Ashton took his hand and shook it vigorously, almost knocking Jacob's glasses from his face, which he quickly readjusted. "For what you've done for us, Mr. Norwood, we couldn't possibly repay you. You've managed to save us all." "Well, it's always good to see a satisfied client." As Ashton let go, Glenn immediately took hold and shook Jacob's hand as well. "Thank you, Mr. Norwood," they both said, followed by, "We can't thank you enough for all of your hard work," the others replied. "It's not a problem, I assure you. We'll find some way to pay you back once we get settled in. It might take us some time, but you can expect it to be grand." After countless handshakes and hugs, Jacob gave them a nod and bid them a fond farewell as he took up his case and bag and turned and headed towards the Bradford town gates. Elise tightly clenched her fists and bit her lip. Taking notice of this, Ashton nudged her forward. "Go on, ask him." Elise, seeing the others encourage her silently with smiles, then took a deep breath and called out, "Mr. Norwood, please wait." Jacob immediately stopped and turned. "Yes? Mr. Norwood, what you did for my town? I mean, it was... Thank you," she said, turning her face down to her feet. "You're very welcome. But it seems as though you have something else on your mind." "Well, I was just wondering... I was curious if you'd... I'd be grateful if you'd like to come with me."
Elise was absolutely speechless. I could always use some help with my work, and it's not often that someone volunteers. You think you'd be interested? Yes, sir. I'll do everything I can to help. Are you sure? It's not easy work. I want to learn about these echoes, and about being a preservist. I want to see this world, and all that's in it. I want to see the world as you do. I'm glad to hear it. But are you going back right now? Isn't it a bit late for you? Why not stay and rest for the night? While I would like to, I'm afraid I must get back to Mason City with all speed. Then I'll come with you. Very well, then. Shall we go? Yes.